Hello everyone and welcome to the Ticker.com's news channel on YouTube. On this channel, we review stock markets and discuss financial news, market trends, and economic data from Wall Street to Global Street. So let's get started. Wall Street indices soared after the results of the U.S. presidential and congressional elections in the hopes that the next administration will be friendlier to larger businesses. Market indices on Wall Street hit new highs, but sentiment was weak in Europe and Asia, amid worries of rising tensions with the U.S. and possible geopolitical realignments. Moreover, German coalition government collapsed, adding one more level of uncertainty as the largest economy in the Eurozone struggles to expand. Market sentiment was also bolstered after the U.S. Federal Reserve lowered Fed funds target rate range by 25 basis points, meeting the expectations set by many investors. The Fed also signaled that an additional rate cut at the next meeting in December will be dependent on the incoming data and did not rule in or rule out possibilities of a rate cut. The U.S. trade deficit expanded in September to more than two-year high following record imports. Trade deficit jumped 19% to $84.4 billion from a revised $70.8 billion in August, as investment in data centers and semiconductors support import of capital goods. Moreover, retailers accelerated investment in inventories ahead of possible surge in tariffs. The goods trade deficit widened 15% to $109 billion, and deficit with China expanded to $26.9 billion from $24.6 billion. Germany's exports declined and imports rose in September from a year ago, shrinking its trade surplus by 10%. For the first 9 months to September 2024, exports declined 1% from a year ago to 1.18 trillion euros, and import fell 4.2% to 988.6 billion euros. The Bank of England lowered its key lending rates for the second time this year, citing the progress in disinflation over the last few months. The Monetary Policy Committee decided to lower rates by 25 basis points to 4.75%, matching the rate cut in August. But the committee estimated inflation may pick up following the release of latest government budget, which is expected to stimulate economic growth. The Bank of England also lowered its annual economic growth this year to 1% from the previous estimate of 1.25%, and raised its forecast for 2025 to 1.5% from 1.0%. China's trade surplus widened in October after exports soared 12.7% and imports fell 2.3% from a year ago, respectively. Trade surplus jumped to $95.3 billion from $57 billion a year ago. China's exports continue to advance despite higher tariffs in the U.S. and Europe, as price discounts and demand ahead of Christmas season supported higher shipments. The exports to the U.S. increased 8%, to the Asian region advanced 15.8%, and to the European Union increased 12.7%. In other economic news, Sweden's central bank lowered its key lending rates by an aggressive 50 basis points to 2.75%, and policymakers hinted more rate cuts may be needed in the near future. Norges Bank left its key lending rates unchanged at 4.5% as the central bank fights elevated inflation. In Asia, China announced first fiscal stimulus measures to support local government finances, and Japan's real household spending declined for the second month in a row in September. Let us review key events in global bond, currency, and commodity markets last week. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury edged lower to 4.29% after the Federal Reserve lowered the Fed funds rate range by 25 basis points to between 4.5% and 4.75%. Crude oil prices increased 2% to $72 a barrel, but gains were limited after the supply disruptions were eased, and China's October crude oil imports dropped 9%. Natural gas price rose 9% to 42 euros per megawatt hour in Europe due to colder weather forecast and an expected reduction in wind power production next week. The euro hovered near a three-month low of $1.07 after Germany's coalition government collapsed, setting the stage for election uncertainty and resurgent U.S. dollar. The yen stabilized at 152.70 against after Finance Minister Kato signaled that the government will take appropriate actions to prevent excessive foreign exchange fluctuations. We now shift our attention to major stock markets in the US, Europe, and Asia. The S&P 500 index and the Nasdaq Composite jumped more than 4% following the results of the U.S. presidential and congressional elections, lifting hopes of business-friendly policies of the next administration. European markets extended losses for the third week in a row after the German coalition government collapsed. Nikkei 225 stock average halted a 3-week slide as Japanese stocks tracked the gains in the U.S. tech stocks. Hong Kong and China indices rebounded, but after the close, China announced smaller than expected fiscal stimulus to support local market finances. Indian market indices halted a 5-week slide amid a mixed batch of earnings and a steady inflow of funds from domestic investors. Let us shift our attention to merger deals, market movers, and earnings updates from leading companies last week. Lyft jumped 26% after the company reported its quarterly results and issued a stronger than expected outlook. ARM Holdings, the UK-based fabless chipmaker, reported better than expected quarterly results. Wolfspeed plunged 25% after the advanced chipmaker reported lower than expected revenues in the latest quarter, and the company's outlook fell short of market expectations. Five Below and Dollar Tree dropped more than 10% on the worry that the U.S. will impose as much as 60% tariff on goods made in China next year. CVS Healthcare reported a sharp decline in earnings in the third quarter, largely because of the weakness in its insurance business and restructuring charges related to store closures. Sony Group said sales increased 2% to a record high of 5.9 trillion yen, or $39 billion, for the first 6 months to September, while net profit surged 36% to $3.7 billion, driven by robust sales of games and semiconductors. Nissan Motors said its net profit in the first half fell 93%, lowered its global vehicle sales target in the current fiscal year to March 2025 to 3.4 million from 3.65 million units, and decided to sell 10% stake in Mitsubishi Motors as its businesses in China and the U.S. continue to struggle. International Consolidated Airlines Group, parent company of British Air and Iberian Air, reported better than expected earnings, but Air France-KLM reported weak quarterly results. ArcelorMittal, the world's second largest steel maker, reported third quarter core earnings fell 69% amid softer demand in the U.S. and Europe, and the company reiterated its annual capital expenditure estimate between $4 billion and $4.5 billion. Richemont declined after the Swiss luxury goods and fashion company reported weaker than expected first half earnings, weighed by weakness in sales in China. In the week ahead, investors are looking forward to the release of consumer and producer price inflation reports for October in the U.S. Both reports are likely to show easing of inflation, but core consumer inflation is expected to stay above the Fed's target rate. Retail sales are expected to rise at a slower pace in October, while industrial production is expected to contract. In addition, Applied Materials, Home Depot, Cisco Systems, and Walt Disney are scheduled to release their quarterly results. In Europe, the UK, and the Eurozone are set to release third quarter GDP growth updates, and final inflation data from Germany, France, and Italy are also due. China is set to release a flood of economic data including retail sales, unemployment rates, housing prices, industrial production, and inflation reports. India is scheduled to release its international trade data, inflation reports, and industrial production update. Japan is expected to show a slight economic growth in the third quarter amid persistent weakness in the yen and weak consumer spending growth. You can review daily U.S. and global financial market news, stock movers, earnings releases, SEC filings, and economic updates on ticker.com and 123jump.com. You can find the latest financial books on Rodera.com, keep up with financial industry events on eventsinamerica.com, review ETF and mutual fund performance and in-depth profiles on tickerfunds.com, and review market updates and stock movers in India on niveshak.in. That is all for today, and we will see